Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Syrian analyst Ehsani joins us today, and we talk about the financial crisis that's been building for years and the structural problems in Lebanon's economy and the banking system that's been in place since the 1990s. The Beirut explosion and the widespread damage brought the broader crisis to a head, and it exposed how the system's broken. We also talk about the political issues, the protests, and external interference. There's a bonus question for patrons at the end of the interview on whether this is a push for regime change, color revolution, and which external forces are at play. Ehsani is a Syrian American, born in Lebanon, raised in Aleppo. He has a solid background in finance. You can find his analysis and discussion on Twitter at Ehsani22. He has also written for the Syria comment blog under the pseudonym Ehsani. We recorded this on August 18th, 2020. Ehsani is here speaking to us from the New York area. Hello, Ehsani. I have been a long time. It's great to talk with you again.
Thanks. Good to talk to you again.
So today we're going to talk about Lebanon. For a number of months now, I have been following Ehsani's Twitter stream in which he's written a lot of analysis. He has a solid background in finance and an interest in Lebanon. He was born there, raised in Aleppo, but born in Lebanon, and of course an interest in the region. But he was describing this financial crisis and the long-term effects of it, despite, what you might have heard in the media. He and others were sort of giving the real down low of what they were seeing. And I think it's really important. The Beirut explosion is obviously a major event, but there was a major crisis in the works before that. A lot of people seem to think that it has brought it to a head. And I guess there are a lot of ways you could think about it. But if we could start there, so I'm just going to I'm just going to summarize some reports that I've heard recently. It said that after the explosion in Beirut, Al Jazeera English reported that 50,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, 300,000 people were affected. The Lebanese currency is down 80% against the dollar. Inflation is up by 90%. And people need all their money for their daily needs, and they have no spare cash to reconstruct, to fix, their homes and such. And this one guy says the middle class has basically just disappeared. The IMF is talking about like a $10 billion loan. Others are estimating that the Lebanese banks need something like $96 billion to be solvent again. So, I mean, with this framing, what are we seeing here? What did you see coming, and how does this change anything?
I think that one has to step back and think of the Lebanon situation as a set of sort of unrelated events, but related at the same time. I mean, if you start with the financial crisis, has been talked about, and a number of observers have been warning of such for actually years. But as many things in life, when they go on for so long, a lot of these voices get dismissed over time. So anyone that is really involved in finance in any significant way knew all along that something just didn't add up. And not to make this too technical, but essentially, in a nutshell, a country that has a fixed exchange rate, unless that country has tremendous surpluses in trade, or is very oil rich, tremendous amount of revenues of foreign exchange, it's very hard to hold on to a fixed exchange rate. And Lebanon did just that for 23 years. And the longer it did it, the more people thought, well, it's true that in economics this is really hard to do, but this country seems to be able to pull it off. And therefore, a lot of the people just over time thought there's something special about this place. The central bank governor got awards alongside this narrative, and until, of course, the laws of economics came back with a vengeance, of course, and we found out that the currency, was being kept fixed by essentially the central bank borrowing money from the banks and using those funds to support their local currency. So when that issue got exposed, there was what people call a run on the banks, where a lot of the depositors, essentially got wary that something like this might happen, try to go and pull their money out, but there's this thing called capital controls, and they closed the banks, and they said to you essentially all your deposits, and that's about $120 billion, which just in for people who live in the U.S. at least, for the size of Lebanon, this is a substantial amount of money. I mean, it would be, say, about 3 times GDP, which would be the equivalent of almost $60 trillion in the US. So this is a very, very large amount of money for a country of that size. Capital control essentially meant that if you had any deposit in the bank, you no longer had access to it. And you were essentially subject to the bank manager telling you, I can give you 300 a week or 200 a month, depending on availability. Now, the Beirut explosion, obviously, it's still very early innings here, and the investigations are ongoing. I have absolutely no way of knowing, obviously, who the final thing was. To me, it was negligence plus corruption at the ports. But again, this is not here. I'm not here to offer, personal opinions, because it's just an opinion, and I don't think that is worthwhile listeners' time. I do believe that, obviously it was a monumental event. I mean, it's a monumental event to a country that is already shell shocked, really, from the financial issue. I mean, you're talking about just imagine everyone's life savings is sitting in banks. You can't access the currency, goes from $1 buying 1,500 of the local currency to all of a sudden to 8,000 and 9,000 standards of living. So a salary of a person that was making, say, $1,000 in US dollars is now down to $200
Mm.
by the time the explosion happened. And so you're talking about a very, very significant fall in standards of living. So the explosion, I think it just shell shocked people, because it just showed how broken the system is. I mean, and by the way, that is regardless of what the final outcome is, whether it's sabotage or whether it is an accident, or whether, whatever it is, it just shows people that following what had happened in the financial issue, we really have a broken system here on all fronts. Um, this is where we are right now. I think the investigations, as I said, the government made a very, very silly mistake at the beginning by saying we need 5 days before we offer the results of our investigation. Obviously, that was very woefully inadequate time. Yesterday, the president said this is going to take longer. This is complex, and the investigations are ongoing. As you know, the FBI, through David Hale, sent its own team. The French have got their own team, and so now I think that you are going to get professional investigators involved, and we will see what the results produce.
But in the meantime, pretty much the entire government, the top level of government has resigned, right? So who is in
Right.
charge? Who's in charge now?
Yeah, so basically, the same government that resigned is in charge, because although officially, constitutionally, they're basically carrying the tasks of running the government, because you can't have complete void in the people. So it's still the same prime minister sitting there, but without his constitutional direct duties. So it's a very difficult time because the feeling was that people in the opposition to the government wanted also the parliament to be dissolved and the president to step down. I mean, what has stopped in Lebanon, which is the government resigning, is really the weakest link of the three. You talk about the president's office, then you talk about the parliament, and then you talk about the government. The government who resigned is really not the most critical to the opposition here, and I think that both the president and the parliament have given absolutely no hints that they're going to follow up with any resignations themselves. They are steadfast that we are not going to be coward. They gave two speeches, one by the president and one by the leading voice, Tayyar Jabran Basil, who both gave essentially hints that we will not be pushed aside or roll over by what has been said or discussed in social media or even on the streets.
So there's a lot of talk about how the central bank was a Ponzi scheme, about how the political elites, always seem to win, to come out okay in these situations. Um, and can you expand on that a little bit? I can remember this wasn't a surprise to hear this because I had seen you and others talk about this for, I don't know, maybe a year now
Yeah,
in the
almost a
lead
year.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe a little more detail on how that system functioned
Yeah,
and why it was a Ponzi scheme.
yeah, it's like I personally don't like to use terminologies of that sort. I mean, it is really just about, very simply, um, what people mean when they say Ponzi scheme is that for the system to survive, you need new money to keep coming in, and that's where the word Ponzi scheme comes from, because essentially in a Ponzi scheme, it can only survive if new fresh money comes into the scheme.
Right.
Now, what was interesting about Lebanon's case is it needed per year almost anywhere between $8 and $9 billion to come in fresh every single year, on top of what was already there. Now, if that didn't materialize, then the authorities, in this case the central bank, would have problems keeping the exchange rate fixed. And the minute the inflows stopped coming in, and the $7 or $8 billion went down to minuscule levels, the pressure on the system increased. When the pressure on the system increased, what they did was they jacked interest rates even higher to attract those funds that are now questioning whether they should come or not. So let's put it in perspective. Before, they were paying about 2.5% over US dollar interest rates, say in New York. If Citibank in New York was paying 2%, Lebanon would have paid you uh, anywhere between 4.5% to 5% on the same deposit and the same currency. Now, when money was coming in, being satisfied with that kind of premium, when it stopped, the central bank said, okay, I'll pay you, instead of 2.5% over New York rates, I'll pay you 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it took just to bring that last dollar in. And that's what people mean by a Ponzi, because that's exactly what happens in a Ponzi. You start to pay higher and higher interest rates or profits for the marginal last guy that is thinking of coming. And that's essentially the genesis of how at the end it all fell through, because in fact there is always a level where if you keep paying higher interest rates, then you really raise the alarm bell, and people will start, wait a second, this makes really no sense now. I mean, before 2.5%, they thought, okay, it's sort of, now when you're paying someone 10 and 11%, even a very even people who are really looking to make an extra premium will sort of second guess, and they will start to ask themselves, wait a second, this is almost too good to be true now. And that's kind of what transpired towards the end. Where is this money when you talk about elites and when you talk about, I mean, I have a little bit more of a technical background on this, because to me it is really just a matter of a country that effectively imports almost everything that they consume, and they export very, very little. If you just speak of any example of a country like this, the only methodology, the only economic repercussion from this kind of setup would be that a currency would continue to weaken, and as it weakens, it makes new imports more expensive, and that's how you have a stabilizer effect. I mean, the reason most countries run floating exchange rates, which are exchanges that are moving, just like the dollar and the euro and the yen and all the major currencies, why they are free to float, is because by floating, they help correct a lot of the imbalances. Why people don't like fixed exchange rates is because when you fix an exchange rate, you no longer have a metric that is being moving up and down to correct those imbalances. So these imbalances not only remain, but they keep on getting bigger and bigger, and that's what happened in the case of Lebanon. The longer the fixed exchange rate remained in place, the larger those imbalances in trade became. And this is why at the end, when you do finally let it go, so to speak, the currency moves from 1,000 to 8,000 in a matter of a few months, because the imbalances have been accumulating. Is like boiling something, and you have the lid on, and you just took the lid off, and you see the result almost instantaneously.
So another comment that was made was that some of the issues with Lebanon, well, first of all, they sound kind of familiar to me, except that we can print money. So, and we have the
Okay,
global currency.
okay.
But,
So this
it
is
says the bankers and the political elite are in control of, almost everything, and the regulators are really allies, sometimes veterans of the banks themselves. So, don't we
right.
have a similar situation here? But I guess the big factor is that, we don't have a fixed currency.
No, we don't have the same situation here. I'll tell you why. Because the main issue with Lebanon is that it was borrowing not their own currency. If the entire Lebanese economy was actually trading and borrowing their own currency, there would be no problem. What we do in the US, if you call it money printing, again, I don't like to use that word, but let's say we do, you're printing your own money. So that's fine. You're not borrowing somebody else's. The problem with Lebanon, the reason Lebanon is liabilities that they have is not in their local currency. They have in local, but very little. The vast majority of their liabilities, and where the trouble is because they have borrowed dollars. The
Dollar
central bank,
denominated debt. Okay.
right, right. This is the problem. I mean, every country that goes into a borrowing binge or a money printing binge, doing it in your own currency, you will just have inflation, and your currency weakens. That's a very standard thing that happens all over the world. The problem in this particular case was that you borrowed, and the central bank itself was borrowing US dollars from the commercial banks. That's where the problem is.
Hmm. So
Now,
they
as
weren't,
far as,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, as far as the elites and so on, I mean, okay, so this was an extremely profitable enterprise, right? Because if you're a bank, you knew that if you paid me X, and I am the depositors, I come into your institution and you pay me on my deposit, say 5%, you're going to take that money and give it to the central bank and earn, say, 7%. So you were effectively like a broker. The bank was really a broker, taking the depositor's money and placing it with the central bank. Now, this is a very profitable exercise when you do it on $120 billion equivalent. And so, if you're a politician, or if you're a high net worth individual, or you are anywhere connected, you want to get on this act, because whether by being a shareholder or whether by being a friend of a friend, I mean, this has gone on now since this country came out of the civil war. This pact, so to speak, was put together somewhere around the early 90s. And if you really knew anything about finance back then, you were really, really paid to get into this banking industry. And sure enough, the banking industry became 3 times. I mean, the assets that they have were almost actually 5 times the size of GDP. So if you take the collective banking system, all the balance sheets of the banks, add them up together under a consolidated balance sheet, the assets and the size of the banking system was 5 times national income, which is by any stretch, by any imagine. I mean, maybe just Luxembourg and Hong Kong would compare. And so this is why when people talk about the politicians and the elites getting in, yeah, I mean, duh, it's like a no-brainer. It's such a profitable industry. Just a case in point, as the economy started to weaken significantly after Syria's war started, so Lebanon's economy decelerated to almost zero growth over the last 3 to 4 years. In spite of that, when the economy is hardly growing, these banks were making significant amount of money, a total of about $2 billion a year in profits, even when the economy was hardly growing at all, which shows you that this was a very, very good business to be in. And it's no wonder every connected person and every tycoon and every politician would want to get on the act.
So, since we mentioned the Syrian war, the other issue that Lebanon had and other countries surrounding Syria was they had a very large number of refugees who were living there, I don't know, kind of long term for a number of years.
Sure.
So what happens to, I don't know, how does that play into this?
Not that much. I mean, the refugees, look, most of the if you study refugees of civil wars, the vast majority of them historically actually never come back. I
Right.
mean, there are studies who have showed this. Look, I have written and thought about this for years now. I don't believe the Syrian refugees who are in Jordan, Turkey, or Lebanon are ever coming back. Particularly when you talk about the sanctioned country. I mean, the more you sanction Syria, the chances of anyone coming back dwindle by the minute. And so, why would anybody go back to that place? And they won't. So I don't think that Lebanon's refugee issue. Now, it just happens that there is a very large number of refugees in a smaller country vis-a-vis Turkey. Turkey is much larger, so it could take and absorb, the people a lot easier. But in Lebanon, I don't think that the refugees, they are just going to become a permanent feature of this conflict.
And I guess it's not all that uncommon for people to move among those countries. I mean, I guess less common than Americans going to another country, although, we have people coming here all the time, but it seems that there are a lot of people who are originally from Lebanon who are somewhere else now, for example. And, peeps, as we know, Syrians, millions of Syrians are in other countries. But so at this point, though, so they're trying to stop capital flight, and people can only whatever money they've put in the bank, they can only take out like a minuscule amount. In some cases, like $200 a month.
Correct.
And yet, food costs, because almost everything's imported, food costs, a much higher. I mean, how is anybody going to survive?
Yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult because I think to answer your question, everyone's going to depend. Lebanon has got a very powerful diaspora that live abroad, have done extremely, extremely well economically. Yes, they've lost money during their deposits being under capital control and so on, but they still have an immense wealth that will be now essentially sent to people who are living there. So if you have a cousin who's really suffering, you're going to send them $300, $500, $1,000 a month. Now, this is short term. This is just trying to sort of patch up the situation, but this is exactly the same in Syria as well. I mean, you can almost it's almost shocking to think how people could make ends meet, uh, but they do it by either handouts, by going to churches, to mosques, to calling relatives abroad, and just short-term fix until you always believe that this can't get any worse and it's going to turn around. but sadly and usually they do get worse.
Yeah, I can remember you posting pictures of people in the Aleppo area. I mean, just cooking oil or heating oil. I'm not even sure which kind of fuel they were talking about. Just, lines for blocks in
Yeah,
freezing
yeah,
temperatures just to get simple
yeah,
things.
yeah. It's a permanent feature of life, and after a while, this is, you just think this is normal. You just grow to get used to it, and it becomes part of everyday life.
So, in terms of the solution to all this, or an easing, or
Yeah,
a restructuring, so there's a lot of the quote unquote international community
sure.
stepping in, and I have a bonus question for you.
Hmm.
Um, Again, I don't want to make it sound like Al Jazeera English is the only one
Hmm.
I go to, but this happens to be from Al Jazeera English as well. They were doing an interview with an elderly man who lives in Beirut, and they said to rebuild, Antoine and thousands of others need foreign donor help. That cash will only likely be released when this country has a cabinet and a prime minister acceptable to the international community.
Hmm.
And then on another show, there was an interview with a guest named Mohammed Haj Ali from Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And he said, among other things, that if Lebanon strikes a peace deal with Israel, that this deal has been on the table, I guess, for a long time, that if they do strike that peace deal, then reconstruction money will flow to rebuild their country and especially rebuild their, sad infrastructure.
Hmm.
So this kind of thing, um, it seems like a regime change or type pressure from the outside. I agree with you that the official story about negligence and corruption and so on in the port seemed to be the reason for the Beirut explosion. And people who I trust also believe that, or at least at this point they do. More information could come out. But if is this pressure on Lebanon to completely change their structure? If so, who's behind it, or who are the competing forces behind it? And what is this international community that people talk about? What is it exactly? The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at patreon.com/around the empire or at the website aroundtheempire.com under episode 176 Extra, Financial Crisis and Solutions in Lebanon. So I'm not good at marketing. It's not my forte. I don't like it. But I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons, as is necessary for independent media like this, funded solely by listeners. Because I appreciate them, they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of the show, compensate a little bit for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will subscribe to the podcast on Patreon to get these kinds of extras. There's also some full episodes for patrons only, and we now have a Discord channel for patrons, and I hope to do some live stream sessions for patrons only where we can talk about things among ourselves, do Q&A sessions, and all that. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. Okay, well, thank you for that. And is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap up?
No, no. I mean, I think we covered all the issues. I mean, it is a very interesting place to watch. First, for the obviously financial issue that I find extremely fascinating, but the explosion was just another crazy incident that really nobody saw coming. Now with the Hariri investigation, the results are out today. There was nothing really massively, huge in terms of implicating the leadership either in Syria or in Hezbollah, and this is just going to be a very difficult time for Lebanon going forward. Really difficult time. I am not of the view that there will be a magic solution anytime soon, but I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope you're wrong too. Um, but I'm afraid that you're not. Okay, well, tell people how they can find you, find your work, follow your work, and then we'll wrap up.
No, I just use my Twitter account, Ehsani22, and most of the thoughts I put, I'm just an observer. I just love the region, follow it, very passionate about what is happening there, particularly in both countries, and just give my own personal opinions only. That's all I do.
Right, and I appreciate that very much. Thanks so much for coming back on the
Thank you.
show.
Thanks for calling. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Ehsani. Follow him on Twitter at Ehsani, EHSANI 22. Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are lots of ways to find and listen to the syndicated audio podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.